Colonel Wilkerson, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, although I don't think I've ever been on it before, so it's not back.
Oh, actually, yeah, you were on a couple of years ago, right around the onset of the war in Ukraine. And
Oh, okay.
I did want to speak about that a bit today.
You have
I
a
also
better memory than I do.
I did want to speak about that a bit today. Also, what's been happening in Syria, but the big news that's been sort of breaking over the last couple of days has been these drone sightings in New Jersey, and there's reports now that they've been appearing outside of a naval facility in New Jersey. I know that it's again sort of breaking news and an odd thing, but I'm just wondering if you may have any sort of thoughts on this, and what the government's response should be to these drones.
I have a very considered response. It may not be right with this particular incident or incidents, but I think it is right in the larger picture. I've been monitoring the Pentagons and others, private contractors who are doing this, and just some independent guys who are former intelligence professionals work on extremism in this country. And my bet would be that this is something like that manifesting itself. We have had, as you probably are aware, drive-by shootings of transformers.
Yeah,
Um,
North Carolina, I believe.
yeah, other things like that, isolated incidents out in the Pacific Northwest. One attempt out there a feeble attempt, but nonetheless, it looked like an attempt to blow up a dam. Um, I think we're going to have more of this in this country. We're calling it violent extremism. Others are calling it domestic terrorism. Call it what you will. I think we've got an unsettled group in this country that is willing to take violent action.
So who do you think that is exactly? Because again, just when you're looking at the scale of how many drones would be involved here, it seems as though that would have to be something that's well funded.
Well, I watch guys fly drones around here in my own neighborhood. It doesn't, as the Houthis in Yemen have proven, I think, it does not take a lot of money to fly drones. Now, my son is an RPV pilot, has been one for 14 years almost. He flies one of the most sophisticated RPVs in the world. Don't call them drones, he says. They're remotely piloted vehicle or aircraft. He flies Reapers, and they are formidable. They're costly, but these little drones that you fly around and take pictures of naked women in their bathrooms with, they're pretty cheap, really, when you consider it, what it gives you the ability to do. And I don't mean that, but there are people who do that. I know police forces around here that have them, and I predicted some of this 5 or 6 years ago that we would have a lot of well, not a lot, but I know enough because my son-in-law is a Montgomery County policeman, the county just north of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And the police sometimes take liberties with these drones and fly them around and do all manner of things that they probably shouldn't be doing. Certainly, they shouldn't be doing under the law. So it's becoming a common feature. You may know that there were smugglers using drones to fly weapons into Canada. And it was a very unsophisticated, sophisticated operation. They were flying pistols, 9 or 10 at a time, which is about all the bag with the pistols in it, all the drone could handle. They'd fly over into Canada across the border, drop the bag in someone's backyard, and then a prearranged meeting would come in and, pick them up and sell them. And in Canada, a 38 Smith and Wesson goes for $2,500 or more. So they were making quite a profit. The U.S. and Canada cooperated and caught one group doing it, but who knows who else is doing it? That's a long border.
This kind of brings to mind what happened a few years ago with the Chinese spy balloons, and there was all this news at the time of these different balloons floating across the U.S. And then, it was a very big deal, and then the story seemed to go away. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that overall. Would you think that was sort of an isolated series of incidents as well, or that's something that was just something that happens and continues to happen, and it just sort of made it into the news temporarily?
I actually have a pretty strong opinion on that. I think the Chinese have always done that, basically with weather balloons, but they are smart people. They might have had a camera or two or whatever hooked up to a couple of the weather balloons. And we just decided it was an opportune moment because we were beginning to become very bellicose with regard to China. Unlike my administration, we cooperated with China. China cooperated with us. That'd be the George W. Bush administration. One of the few accounts that Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, had almost to himself once he wrested it away from Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, essentially over the April 10th, 2001 incident with the EP-3 and F-8 collided in the South China Sea. A true emergency, but Powell handled it in 24 hours, and from then on out, he had the China account. So we're becoming far more bellicose with regard to China. So we were looking for opportunities, and oh, there's a balloon. Let's say it has something on it. Let's say it's a security violation. Oh, it's Chinese. Let's do it 2 or 3 times. I think that's what that was more than anything else.
Well, I have to ask also because something that's sort of always in the news and has been in the news the last couple of days are UFO sightings as well. And, this is something obviously a lot of people have different theories about. Some people think that it's extraterrestrial. Some people think that it's secret aircraft. Some people think that maybe it's even a psyop that the government is perpetrating to make people think that there are extraterrestrials. I'd just be interested to know, given your experience in the U.S. government and military, what your thoughts are generally on UFO sightings.
All three, and maybe some more. And I say that not just offhand. I say that because there are some nefarious things going on that are private. Some of them are public-private, and some of them are real secrets that get revealed. I do think that the Air Force, and my son is in the Air Force, my oldest grandson is now in the Air Force, has a file on a lot of things that are inexplicable. The speed, the composition of the material, the photographs that they have, the videos that they have, and so forth. I've seen a few of them, and I think it is largely inexplicable unless you take the route of some scientists who, in some cases, work with the Air Force and say this is a weather phenomenon or this is a phenomenon of electricity in the cloud at that particular time and that light condition or whatever. You can take a scientist and explain mostly anything away. At the same time, there are people in the Air Force, and I happen to be a military professional that thinks that there probably is some other than human life in the universe, or maybe other human life. I don't know, whatever we call human. And that maybe we do have a visitor from now and then. I'm not going to discount that entirely. But I do think a lot of it is just what I call hooray stuff. People, either private or public, wanting to catch someone's attention or deflect someone's attention from a program that might be more deadly and lethal and secretive, and you explain it away by saying extraterrestrials or whatever. There are aircraft flying around, for example, right now that I want to call them eighth and ninth generation fighter aircraft. I don't know what they are officially, but I've seen some of the photos and I've seen some of the videos. There are aircraft flying around over the skies of Texas, Nebraska, places like that, where if the average citizen saw them, just even a former Air Force, a veteran of the Air Force, out 15 or 20 years, would not know what he was looking at or she was looking at, and they might make a report that they'd seen something odd, and it would be an accurate report because these aircraft are very different looking from customary aircraft.
And I have to wonder too if some of that may be related to the Space Force, which I also would love to get your thoughts on that, seeing as how that was a new branch of the U.S. military that was added in recent years. Do you have any sort of general thoughts on the Space Force? Is that a good thing that the U.S. has that new branch of the military, or do you think it's a waste of money, or just what are your general thoughts?
I think it's another bureaucratic development that we could have done without. But that said, the space components of each of the services, and as you might imagine, principally the Navy and the Air Force, who do dominate the aviation parts, if you will, of the military, even though the Army likes to claim a huge helicopter fleet, which it does have. Um, I think it was probably as good being independently handled by each of the services. There was competition there, and competition sometimes makes it keener, makes the developments better, and so forth. Now we've got a Space Force, It's all there in that one ingredient, or at least that's what we want people to think. It's not really. We're having a battle right now, for example, over the components that are in the Air National Guard. The governors do not want to federalize these components and put them in the Space Force. And the components probably do want to be federalized and put in the Space Force. It's a matter of competition, and it's a matter of governors wanting to handle their own National Guards. I don't know where that's going to go. I suspect ultimately the federal boys will win because, after all, they pay the money for the Guard as much as they do for the active duty military. So, but is it a necessary component? Here's what we did at the Naval War College when I was a professor up there in the late 80s, right before I joined Colin Powell. We had a sort of a special team that got together and looked at the prospect of militarizing space. Now, at that point, and I thought it was a wise decision on the part of several presidents, we had agreed with the Soviets and with others that we weren't going to militarize space. And I think that was a wise decision because it meant a new arms race, and it would have been helter-skelter, and it would have been very costly. So we managed through that process of agreement to stop that for a long time. Now we're probably in it. We're probably in an arms race in space. Dominating space, of course, would mean dominating this planet in a way that no geographical position on the planet would offer. So it's a serious race now. I think what we came up with in that study group, it sounded awfully futuristic in 1988, 1989, but we came up with a Space Force, period. That's the only force the United States had, because that's where everything was happening. Now, we still had militia, if you will. We still had components, terrestrial components, if you will. But they did things mostly like disaster relief and humanitarian assistance and so forth. They didn't fight wars. All the wars were out off the planet, if you will. And increasingly, we got further and further out as we assumed technology and such would advance and we'd be able to operate further and further out. And wars, wars, became fought in space, or were fought in space. We had all kinds of concepts we developed, space troopers. You've seen some of the science fiction, I'm sure.
Right.
And we all in this group, and in almost any group, forward-looking group in the military I've ever been associated with, and I've been associated with quite a few, we always looked at science fiction very closely because we thought science fiction, global science fiction, written all across the world, some great science fiction in China, for example, predicted the future better than futurologists. Better than the people who were supposed to be doing that. Certainly better than the people at Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or any of those places. So we paid a lot of attention to science fiction.
Well, Colonel, I also wanted to have you on the show today to discuss some other recent news, what happened in Syria. And I think that everyone was kind of shocked with how quickly the Assad government fell there. And I just would love to know your thoughts on, maybe how and why that happened. Again, because the war has been happening there for over a decade, the civil war in Syria. And obviously, the U.S. has been intimately involved, funding different factions and different sides of that war. Donald Trump bombed Syria when he was president the first time. But again, just how quickly the Assad government fell in seemingly the course of a week or two, it really shocked the world. So, do you have any thoughts on what sort of caused that?
It was a surprise, I think, to almost everyone, including those who were responsible for it ultimately. And that would be Israel, the United States, and Turkey. The United States probably more than anyone else, although Israel was certainly instrumental in the immediate happenings. But the United States, since my president, and maybe even before that, I have not found it in the archives, but I know about it from having been in the Bush administration, George W. Bush. When we were operating on what essentially was the clean break strategy, which Bush's dad had refused to adapt, and then Bush came in, and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and he adapted it or adopted it. They did adapt it too, because it wasn't quite what Paul Wolfowitz and others, when they wrote it, had meant it to be. But one thing it did do was say there was going to be a chain of victories in the Levant. It was going to start with Iraq, as it did in 2003, and as soon as that was accomplished, it was going to go to Syria. And the thought was that Hussein would fall so fast and so rapidly and so devastatingly, and they thought it would take about 50 days to end the whole operation. That was Rumsfeld's prediction. And originally, he only wanted 55,000 troops to do that. Tommy Franks talked him into a little bit more. But then they were going to Syria. But they didn't think it would be anything but a cakewalk, because Assad would have seen what happened to Hussein and would probably, either surrender or accommodate the invasion. Didn't happen, because the insurgency, as we all know now, broke out in Iraq, and we were very busy. And Powell talked Bush into honoring his, under Geneva, occupying power responsibilities. And so we began to do what George Bush didn't want to do. We began to nation build in Iraq, and we put Syria off. But we didn't put it off very far, because what Bush did was call George Tenet in, then the director of the CIA and also the DCI at that time, Director of Central Intelligence. He had two hats till we created the DNI. Make Assad fall. So didn't have a presidential finding with it. I can't find it in the records anywhere, and I've looked through the records even for just an indicator. There's no national security decision document for the Bush administration for the invasion of Iraq either. Unprecedented. No decision by the president codified in a document to invade Iraq. And this was an administration very fearful of archiving things. It didn't want history to look at it. Powell was the same way, as a matter of fact, at the State Department. He did not like to commit things to paper, because paper has a way of haunting you in the future. So there was no presidential finding, but he told Tenet, go make Assad fall, and Tenet went right off, and we have been trying to make Assad fall ever since. Now, President Obama in 2015, as I recall, actually formalized it, issued a presidential finding, and I'm told got the permission, at least, not permission, but blessing, of the HIPSI and the SISI, the two intelligence committees in the Congress, go ahead with it. And we appropriated a couple $100 million to do it, too, under Obama. So this has been a long-term effort by the United States, but no one knew that it was going to come to fruition the way it did and with the rapidity with which it did. But they should have, and here's why. We put the most draconian sanctions we have ever put on any state on Syria. Let me just give you a small indicator. If you were a lieutenant in the Syrian regular army, didn't matter who you were, you could even be an Alawite, but anybody lieutenant, let's say you were making about $200 a month, which would have been pretty good, equivalent US, and you had a family, a wife and a kid, and your morale was not all that bad, because that was enough for you to live on. Now you're making $30. You still got the wife, you still got the kid, you're making $30. You've taken a $170 decrement in your pay. That's across the Syrian army of armed forces, period, because the sanctions were so draconian. Inflation was off the charts. The Russians and the Iranians were both telling Assad that his army was falling apart, that he needed to do something. And what Assad did was he turned towards the Arabs. He reconciled, if you will, with the Arabs. He was re-entered into the Arab League, and he thought that was where his future lay. And he didn't worry too much about the demoralized state and atrophy of his armed forces. I'm not sure he knew how bad it really was, because his generals were probably lying to him. And so when it happened, not only did U.S. aircraft and Israeli aircraft bomb the bejesus out of them while the rebels were moving, they also were falling apart themselves. They had no desire to stay in a military that was causing them to live like paupers. And so it all fell apart. Now there's more to it than that, but it just all fell apart. And all of a sudden, Jelani was moving rapidly and swiftly, and, Aleppo, Homs, all the way down to Damascus. Now the question becomes, and this was aided and abetted by Israel, of course, because when Israel made the ceasefire with Hezbollah, the reason it made the ceasefire at the time it did, it was by no means through with Hezbollah. In fact, it was pretty much a standoff at that point in terms of casualties and who was winning and who was losing. He made the ceasefire because we asked him to and told him he was going to have to help us with Syria because we envisioned that when Erdogan, who is the real instrument behind the actual happenings on the ground, moved into Syria, pushed all those 3 million Syrian refugees in front of him back into Syria, fought the Kurds in Syria, and started this commotion up in the north, that we might be on the brink of having some movement that would eventually upset Assad and overthrow his government. Not as quickly as it did. I don't think anyone envisioned that. So Israel said, oh, yes, of course, we'll be right there with you. And of course, now Israel has tanks on the outskirts of Damascus. And I understand that on Mount Hermon now, and I saw a picture of this. The Jewish settlers there, the Israeli Jews, who have settled in Golan and are settling in Golan and on the West Bank in general, are now skiing on Mount Hermon and taking pictures because Mount Hermon is very high and Damascus lies in the plain, and you can take pictures of the whole route to Damascus. So I don't expect Netanyahu to leave that anytime soon. In fact, Defense Minister Katz just said that they will be there at least a year. Look for that to be extended and then extended again because Israel is going to grab as much territory next to the Golan Heights as it can. That highway from the Golan to Damascus has always intrigued me as a historical fan and a practitioner of blitzkrieg armored warfare. I would put my tanks on that highway and be in Damascus in less than 6 hours and take Syria. That's what I would have done if I were Israel. Now, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that that was the prospect because that's what it looks like to a military professional. Well, they didn't have to do that. They got it. They helped bomb the Syrian army. We helped bomb the Syrian army. And now, by the way, Israel has bombed every single solitary thing in Syria that might serve as a weapon for this government. It's incredible what they've done. They have devastated Syria with their bombing, and they were
I
devastated.
believe the U.S. also was bombing after the Assad regime fell in the days after we were bombing.
Probably true. I don't know that, but probably true. I know that Israel's bombing has been devastating and almost hour after hour after hour. No one will ever be able to raise a weapon in Syria as Israel's objective. I don't know if they'll achieve that, but they probably become pretty close.
One has to wonder too, just given the past year, the genocide in Gaza, then the invasion of Lebanon and what was happening there. Now with Syria falling, and also with the exchange of missiles between Israel and Iran. This seems to be part of a much larger trend of something that the Netanyahu government is trying to achieve. Can you just speak to that? Like, what do you see as the real goal here in the Middle East? Is it just to wipe out any kind of opposition to Israel? And if so, doesn't that necessitate a direct war with Iran?
I think, yeah, yes, to answer your question directly, that's the ultimate goal. But I think what we're witnessing is what I would call the dream of the more radical of the Zionists, and that is they want Jordan, they want Syria, they want Lebanon, they want the water there, they want the natural resources there, they want the Levant, either through actual conquering of the territory or that failing their hegemony. Now, who do they want that for besides themselves? They want it for the American empire. And that's why I agree with Lindsey Graham from time to time, and this is probably the only time I agree with Lindsey. We're doing it. We're supporting Gaza. We're supporting Netanyahu. We're funding the genocide in Gaza. We're doing all that we're doing because if he weren't doing it, we'd be doing it. And the censure for us would be incredible and difficult to bear. So he's doing it for us. He even said that to our Congress, to applause from our Congress, that if he weren't doing it, we'd have to be doing it. In other words, he's doing it for us. As long as we say, and we do, that we want to be the hegemon of the entire Southwest Asian region, and that's a very important nomenclature change there. Not the Levant, not the Middle East, Southwest Asia. Iran's a part of Asia. Who else is part of Asia? India, China. Every fifth citizen on the globe now is Chinese. 2 out of 5 are Indian or Chinese, and 3 out of 5 are Asian. The GDPs of the countries in Asia dwarf Europe and the United States combined. The movement of the pendulum of power, which for 3,000 years lingered over Central Asia with China as an engine of that power, whether it was the Mongol hordes or Genghis Khan or later the Moguls, the Persians, all the power was in the East, as it were. Then about 1,000 years ago, it began to morph and move. Started, maybe you could say, with the fall of the Eastern Empire in Rome, then the Western Empire, the Byzantine, and the power moved to ultimately 1945 into World War II and the new empire, the worldwide, globally spanning empire, America. It's going back now. Slowly but surely, it's being sucked back to the east through Central Asia. China's the vacuum cleaner, if you will, the engine. And we're very much opposed to that, as you might imagine we would be. In the past, you saw opposition to the Russian Empire, to the Byzantine Empire, to the Ottoman Empire. Now we're opposed to this power shift going east. And Ukraine and Southwest Asia and Georgia now, where we're trying to open a new front against Moscow, are all part of this. Moscow, Russia has the unfortunate geographical position, I would say unfortunate slash fortunate, question mark, of being in both regions. Russia has as much of its country, its 11 time zone country in Asia as it does in Europe, certainly. Many would say, even though the map says Russia is a European country, it really is only European from the Urals to the west. This catches Russia in a real trick bag because Russia gets blamed for the U.S. not being able to move fast enough against China, and it gets applauded for gas coming to Germany, for example. Of course, we stopped that. We stopped that quickly with Nord Stream 2. And anybody who thinks we didn't blow up Nord Stream 2 is smoking some cheap stuff, because we did. And we did it for that reason. We wanted to break Europe away from any possibility of turning towards Russia, oh, God forbid, towards China, and keep them in our fold, because we saw our hegemony slipping. And that's what Ukraine is all about, too. It's not about defending Ukraine. It's about reasserting our hegemony over Europe. And that's, just take it all the way from Belarusia through Ukraine, through Georgia, all the way down to Bandar Abbas and Chabahar at the southern end of the Persian Gulf. That's our goal. Clean break strategy, chaos in that region in order to disrupt Russia and China, primarily China, and this movement of power away from the West and towards the East.
Well, I think one big question that folks had was, why didn't Russia help Assad stay in power? Because obviously there are these Russian military bases. Actually, the U.S. Had, I believe, bombed them previously, or we got into some conflict with Russia in Syria. So why do you think it was that Putin didn't try to lend a hand to help keep Assad in power?
I think Sergei Lavrov, in his interview in Doha, was pretty explicit about that, if you read between the lines. When he speaks in English, he's clear, and he has a good command of English, but he's not quite as nuanced as he is in Russian. And I say that not speaking Russian myself, but knowing a lot of Russian speakers who have told me that. Um, he kind of obfuscated a little bit in Doha. Where he was really clear was about the potential for nuclear war. And I think that was a clarity that really disturbed me. especially when he talked about Rear Admiral Buchanan and his remarks being a very serious mistake, because that's about what I said to myself when I heard Admiral Buchanan make the remarks. A very serious mistake, saying that we could fight and win. We, the empire, could fight and win a nuclear war. That would have been anathema during the Cold War. He would have been stripped of his rank and put in a prison cell somewhere. Absolutely a violation of everything we learned during the Cold War about nuclear weapon owning states. But Lavrov also said, in addition to the more nuanced things he said, was that he knew who was responsible for Syria. And he said it in plain English: Israel, Britain, and the United States. He said it just like that. He said they are behind the actions in Syria. He's absolutely right. Knowing that, and knowing how pressed Russia is in Ukraine, and knowing that we're trying to open another front, even as I speak, in Georgia, he couldn't afford to get bogged down in some kind of conflict in Southwest Asia. What he will probably do now, if I were he, and if I were giving Putin advice right now, military advice, I would say, you just inked a treaty with Iran. I think the probation period is maybe about another 30 days or so, if I'm understanding the Persian right. But he's got a treaty with Iran. There's no reason why Iran couldn't invite him in to replace, Latakia, however you say that. I'm not familiar with the way the Syrians say it. I've heard it said both ways, Latakia and Latakia, and Taurus, with ports and bases in Iran. Not only would that send a powerful signal to Israel and the United States, but it would also help Russia do something the Russian Empire never achieved in its entire existence. It always lusted after a warm water port at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It tried desperately, dozens of times, to beat the Brits most of the time and get down there. It never achieved it. It could achieve it. It could achieve a port that Iran would probably let it use. Now, mitigating against that, or militating against that, not mitigating, Iran is probably looking now, under the new president and under the vice president Zarif, who was involved heavily in the JCPOA. Iran is probably counting the days to Trump coming to power and wanting to make a deal that's better than the JCPOA, which he's talked about a number of times, with him. In other words, they would like to get sanctions lifted. That's probably one of their most important external goals. And the best way to do that is to court Donald Trump and get him to come into negotiations with them and forge a new deal, and a deal that would lift sanctions and check their nuclear program. I think they would, there are some hardliners who would object, but I think the president, government, and the Ayatollah, even in the Guardian Council, if it were a good deal, would probably do what they did with the JCPOA, which was a good deal too. That is to say, get sanctions lifted and stop their program. I believe that the leaders in Iran, the ones who really are most apt to have power from time to time, are opposed to a nuclear weapon from an Islamic perspective. I've talked with President Ahmadinejad. I've talked with foreign ministers. I think they're sincere when they say the fatwa that they put out, issued, saying that nuclear weapons were anathema, is genuine. I'm not saying they wouldn't build one if they became in extremis, if it were existential to them, but I don't think they want to build one. And so this would be a perfect thing for them to do: turn to the United States and make a deal. So that would militate against Russia being offered a base, I think, at least for the immediate future. But that's how convoluted these circumstances are. I don't think Putin is overly alarmed about losing the base there. I mean, he sortied his fleet out of Tartus into the Mediterranean because he was afraid that, we and the Israelis would bomb it. After all, the Israelis had bombed Russian targets inside Syria knowingly several times before. Is it a real loss for Russia? Not not in the scheme of things. What would be a real loss for Russia would be to have a situation develop in Ukraine that led to nuclear war, and it would be a loss for all of us.
Hey everybody, I hope that you're enjoying today's interview. As many of you know, this is part of my spectacular 10th season. I have lots of big guests returning and lots of new ones as well, but I really do need your help to make sure that this is a successful season for Primo Radical. Please do like, comment, share, and subscribe across all different social media channels. And if at all possible, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Primo Radical. For only $1 a month, you can join the conversation and submit questions to all of my guests. So if at all possible, please do consider becoming a patron. Again, I really do want to help this show grow over its 10th season, so please do like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks again, folks, for the last 9 years of support, and let's make this a great 10th season. Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts overall on what's happening in Ukraine, because, obviously this is... I think the war's coming up on 3 years this February. And, we've had some recent developments with Russia slowly sort of taking these villages, with Ukraine using ATACMS missiles, also Ukraine invading part of Russia. So just overall, what do you see as the status of the war, and where do you see it going, especially with the Trump administration coming back in power next month?
Very concisely, Ukraine has lost and lost dramatically. And if it hangs on a little bit longer, it won't have much of Ukraine left to bargain over. And two, the objective or the people holding up any negotiations are the United States and the moribund Biden administration, particularly Blinken and Sullivan, who should go to jail for their actions. The Congress the other day questioning Tony Blinken looked like they wanted to put him in jail. And if Trump is sincere, he will have a clear path once he's inaugurated.
A clear path to sign a peace deal?
Yes. Now, what worries me, he's the author of The Art of the Deal. Look at what he did with Kim Jong-un. He got the South Koreans all excited about not just a peace treaty after so many years, but the possibility of reunification, which you would be surprised probably, the South Koreans, many of them, a great majority of them, especially those under 40, are very much for. They want their peninsula reunified. And they saw the prospect when Trump met with Kim Jong-un, and then he blew it. He just blew it all out of the water. He didn't follow up on it. So that worries me about Ukraine, too. If it doesn't look like he's going to get a resoundingly Trump-like deal that he can prate over and really, really push and say, look what I did, then I don't think he'll go through with it.
Well, I think that many people are kind of wondering how the deal would even work, right? I mean, just given that, obviously we fund and arm the Ukrainian government, so Zelensky's heavily dependent on us. However, I think that he's said that he would, want to have some sort of NATO umbrella in order to give up any land to Russia, even temporarily.
But one alternative, perhaps, again, this is reported from the United States, and it's fairly simple, really, is that Ukraine joins NATO, but Russia takes control and keeps the land that it has to date. Would that be a possibility?
Ніхто не пропонував нам бути в НАТО.
No one has offered us to be in NATO with just one part or another part of Ukraine.
Закінчити гарячу стадію.
That's for once.
Факт.
The fact is that it is a solution to stop the hot stage of the war, because we can just give the NATO membership to the part of Ukraine that is under our control.
Факт. Можна було б, ніхто не пропонував.
Yes, it could be possible, but no one offered.
Треба робити.
But the invitation must be given to Ukraine within its internationally recognized border.
Ви не можете давати тільки частині.
You can't give invitation to just one part of a country. Why? Because thus you would recognize that Ukraine is only that territory of Ukraine and the other one is Russia.
Тому я і сказав, юридично ми не маємо права
So legally, by law, we have no right to recognize the occupied territory as territory of Russia.
І тут не можна помилятись.
And here
Але
we must not
щоб
make any mistake.
зупинити гарячу стадію війни,
But if we
треба
want to stop the hot
взяти
stage of the war,
зонтик, амбрелу,
we should take under NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control.
швидко. А далі вже
That's what we need to do fast. And then Ukraine can get back the other part of its territory diplomatically.
So, just what do you think like a peace deal would even look like?
Well, I think the first thing we'll have to do is pay the Brits to take him out, or tell him we're going to take him out, and then escort him to one of his billion-dollar dashes. Most of the money that's gone to Ukraine has gone into the oligarchs' pockets, and some of it has gone into Zelensky's pocket. That's Ukraine. I mean, I worked intimately with Ukraine in 2002, 3, and 4, 5, 6, and then one of the most corrupt states in the world. Not going to be a member of NATO. Not now, not 20 years from now, in my view. They should be neutral. They should have been neutral all along. Yours truly was saying they should have been neutral in 2012, 2013. That's what they should have gone for. Swiss-like neutrality because their geographic location begs for neutrality. Putin doesn't want anything more than Ukraine. He doesn't want all of Ukraine. Can you imagine him trying to govern Ukraine with all those partisans who tore the Nazis up, tore the British up, tore the Americans up, tore the Russians up? They would steal your woman and rape her in the woods. That's what Ukraine was good for during World War I and World War II. So, I'm not being pejorative about Ukrainians for any other reason than that's their history. And it sort of is a history that comes out of the proximity that they have to the empires who've waged over their territory, waged war and other conflict over their territory for 1,000 years. So it screams neutrality. Ukraine needs to be neutral. So that's the first point that should be made. You will be neutral. You can look for membership in the EU, but if we apply the conditions that we applied to Turkey, for example, you will never be a member of the EU. 50 years from now, you want to negated your corruption and your skullduggery to the point where you join the EU. But, we passed over a lot of that for a lot of these countries. Can you imagine Albania being a member of NATO? Can you imagine Montenegro being a member of NATO? Well, we've waived all the requirements. Montenegro is the stolen automobile capital of the world. Albania is the trafficking in people capital of the world. So, and we let them into NATO. So, there's always ways to do these things. But Trump should say there are conditions, and the conditions are these. No NATO membership. You don't like that, Zelensky? Hey, MI6, tell this guy where to go. British will do it in a heartbeat. And lay the thing out so that there's a future to it. That is to say, the Russians stay in the de facto, the areas that they have de facto conquered. That means those oblasts that are in the eastern part of Ukraine. And maybe you talk them into referenda by those places in 10 years, 20 years. And a 55% majority is required to see if they want to be neutral, affiliated with Russia, or affiliated with Kyiv. And I'll bet you dollar to donuts, I'll be dead. But I bet they vote for affiliation with Russia because they're mostly Russian speaking and the war will have faded a little bit. So there are ways to fix this problem and to fix it almost semi-permanently, if not permanently. You don't need a demilitarized zone. If you needed a demilitarized zone, guess who'd be violating it all the time? The Ukrainians, not the Russians. So I think if Trump's smart and if his negotiators are smart, and I don't know who he'd put in there because he's not picked a single solitary cabinet member so far that I would say would have the capability to do these negotiations. So who's he going to get to do it? Going to dip down there and get Rudy Giuliani to come back? That crooked son of a gun? It would take a real talent to go sit down with whomever Sergei Lavrov and Putin determine will be their negotiator. And as I said, they got to get rid of Zelensky, or Zelensky's got to do a volte-face, a major change of pace. I don't think he can do that. I don't think he's capable of doing that. So you got to get rid of him. But it's doable. It is doable, and we need to do it because we're killing people on both sides for no reason other than our insane desire to stop the Chinese in their tracks.
Well, Colonel, I know we're running out of time. I did want to ask you quickly a few patron questions. Patrons of the show on Patreon and also premium subscribers on X can submit questions to guests. So I had a few just brief questions for you.
Sure.
First one is from Charmaine. She asks, is there a depth of leadership in Turkey? If Erdogan weren't there, would someone else step in and follow similar policies?
Charmaine, Erdogan is grooming right now as I speak as foreign minister. Look up a YouTube. There's several of them where he's speaking and speaking about serious subjects, and you'll see that he is junior Erdogan, younger, more handsome, and probably smarter ultimately. And it only remains for the AKP to win, and that's not going to be all that simple because Erdogan has really lost some political clout. But this foreign minister is popular, I'm told, so he'll probably be the follow-on.
So next patron question comes from John McCarthy with the Center for Political Innovation. He asks, does DNI Tulsi Gabbard make the world a safer place?
I know Tulsi. I've worked with her on the JCPOA. When we went into first meet her and talked to her when she was a Congress member, a half an hour through our hour briefing, I turned to my team and I said, we don't have to talk to this lady anymore. She knows more than we do. She was so up on the agreement that she impressed me greatly. She knew the details, and at the end of the conversation, she simply said, I can't promise you anything, but I'm going to study it a little bit more, and I'll vote my conscience when I do finish my study. So that was a very good impression I had of her. Since then, I haven't talked to her at all, but she's made some statements and done some things that worry me in terms of her sobriety and her sanity. And I don't mean the trip to Syria or some of the other things she's done, because we should have done some of the things she did. For example, we're not talking to the Russians now at all, period. There is a mandate from Joe Biden not to talk to the Russians. Can you imagine that? In the Cuban Missile Crisis, in the Berlin crisis, all through the Cold War, we talked to the Russians. We never stopped talking to the Russians. We haven't talked to them. Their ambassador told me the other day, their former ambassador, Anatop, we haven't had an ambassador from Russia in 7 months in Washington because no one will talk to him, so why send someone here? This is absurd. So going and talking to the enemy, so to speak, is no blameworthy thing. But I don't know if she has the wherewithal to forge the DNI community the way it should be forged. Trump recognized that it is a weak position. It does not have the money power, and it does not have the people power. Money power, I mean, spread the budget over all 16 intelligence entities and you prioritize DNI. People power, I mean, you take your people where you want them in the community, DNI. You got to have people power and you got to have money power to be a powerful DNI. The second thing you got to have is access to the president. And Trump has said the CIA director will never darken his door. DNI will. That's the way it should be. You shouldn't have this competition with the president with two people, one of whom is the other one's boss. So if Trump did all of that, then Tulsi would have an easier job. But I just don't see the kind of management skills that have to be there. Just same thing with Pete Hegseth, the DOD appointee. I don't see him having the management skills to do half the things that Trump says he's going to do to the military.
Well, final patron question comes from David. He says, it's widely understood that when Trump tried to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, the generals disobeyed him and lied to him. How would Colonel Wilkerson have Trump rectify that issue?
I think that's a famous falsehood fabricated by the team around Trump, because the military told him, in essence, we're pumping oil to Israel. We're doing things that need to be done. We're stealing Assad's oil, which they were doing. Okay, Trump said, how do I get out of this? Well, just blame us. That's what I think happened.
Well, I know we just have a few minutes left. I just love to get a final thought on this. I've always thought that researching Ukraine, it really does trace back to the George W. Bush administration, where we were involved with the Orange Revolution, and then Bush and Cheney obviously were the ones who announced that Ukraine and Georgia were going to be joining
Yep.
NATO. I'm just wondering if
Bingo.
you could briefly speak to that and say, do you really see this conflict in Ukraine as originating with the Bush administration?
I do. I think that's where the clean break strategy took off, and it took off most prominently with the diversion from Afghanistan when we hadn't even finished and invading Iraq. The military was stunned that we were already planning for Iraq in November. We had just gone to Afghanistan in October. General Franks was stunned that we were going to change our focus that way. And we lost Afghanistan in many respects because we made it an economy of force operation working on a shoestring while we concentrated on Iraq, and the Taliban revived. It was a tremendous mistake we made if we cared about Afghanistan in the Bush administration. It all started in the Bush administration. And I was given in 2003 as the chief of staff in the State Department sort of a Ukraine portfolio to look after Yulia Tymoshenko and a whole bunch of other Ukrainians who were just rolling in money that they'd made through cheating their own people. And it was kind of like looking at the oligarchs in the Soviet Union. We made a fortune off both Ukraine and Moscow at the end of the Cold War because we had Goldman Sachs and others in those countries essentially orchestrating the fire sales for fees, really good fees, to all the oligarchs of the old communist assets. Everything from the oil and gas fields to the factories to the hard, heavy industry. We helped orchestrate those sales to the oligarchs in both countries.
Well, Colonel, I really do appreciate your time today. I'd love to have you back on at some point to discuss the developments that are happening in Ukraine, maybe if there is a peace deal to go through that. But for folks out there who would like to follow you and support you, how can they do that?
My email is wilkerlb2014
Wonderful. Well, again, I really do appreciate your time today, and hopefully I can have you back on again sometime soon.
Sure, look forward to it.